And just to finish off what I was saying before, it's a personal pleasure for me to be invited to continue to work with OVAG, especially because of these wonderful people. And these wonderful people, Ida, Wendy, Yenny, I've got to hold it closer because I do not like the microphone and it is a dirty thing, potentially. The reason I raise this now is a large part of what I'm going to be introducing is so we have what is called a shared situational awareness and making sure that basically we're all on the same page when we talk about what risk is and what disasters are and might be. I don't know if this translates, but this first image here is as a cartoon, perceiving the risk, so actually recognizing there might be a risk to happen, communicating the risk, and then managing the risk as well. And we do that because we are communicating primates through art and information sharing and what have you. Also, there needs to be a certain level of justification of what we might consider risks are, hence the second image there. But to reduce the risk of a disaster for this week, I'm eternally by OVAG and especially the OVAG committee to make sure that we can all cope together. So over the next 15 minutes, I've got a quick session on why language matters to make sure we have that shared situational awareness, why we are talking about disaster risk reduction and why we're talking about it now, some fundamental ideas about what it is to be human, and how we can look at what's called an all hazards approach and compare that with risk-based management and how those interlink, and some take-home questions that then will lead into what Kevin will be leading us through for the rest with your case studies and then through the next few sessions. And then I am the warm-up act for my colleague Joe Cashmore, who will be leading on a case study of something he was very heavily involved in, the Victorian forest fires of 2019 and 2020. I said Victoria, I mean Australian, sorry. He was based in Victoria. Okay. This is going to take longer than 15 minutes if it takes longer to change each thing. Okay, all right, so who here, first we're going to mention on communication. Okay, I'm just going to have to stand closer over here, I think, because of the, okay. So you're not going to be able to read this from here, but is it obvious that this is artificially intelligence generated? Greetings, everyone. This is artificially intelligence generated. Who here in their wildlife work has used AI in communicating things? Okay. Who here can recognize when things are AI generated? Okay. That's going to get more and more tricky as it goes further on. But the reason I've used this is looking at ways that we can use the tools that are available to us for better communication. Now, I could read the English version of this, to see if this was accurate, but what I asked, in this case, Microsoft Copilot to do was, can you please design me a cartoon graphic that links the key disaster risk reduction messages with those working with orangutans in Indonesia and Malaysia in a fun and engaging way, but without losing the seriousness of the need. And this is not substituting anything, but I just wanted, and when you have a look and say, this actually works, this doesn't work, this is patronizing, whatever it happens to be. We've lost one of them. But the purpose of sharing it here is that we're going to be constantly being engaged or asked to engage with this sort of new technology. Can I just ask you maybe just to forward it, because otherwise I'm going to have to walk with it. Yeah, thank you. So, In addition to Wildlife Health Australia, I also work with an organisation for the World Organisation for Animal Health that used to be called the OIE. Who has heard of that? Okay, this is good. So they have released a freely available online guide on how you can counter disinformation and misinformation in animal health emergencies. So there's a whole series of do's and don'ts that's included in wildlife specifically as well. And I found that a very useful resource when dealing with either your minister or your local community leader. It's a very good sense of do's and don'ts. And as we come more into the area of artificial intelligence generating misinformation and disinformation, don't also lose sight of the fact that AI could actually be quite useful to be able to share accurate information. Next slide, please. So I've used the word disaster often, and hopefully this talk is not a continuing disaster, but you have a disaster when you have a hazard. So something that causes an issue, such as an earthquake or a landslide or a forest fire or an infectious disease or pollution, and a community that is exposed to that hazard, but that cannot cope. Now, that is what a disaster is. And that is so it's not just a hazard. So an earthquake is not a disaster. It is a hazard, and where it becomes a disaster is the community, whether that a human community or a wildlife community or whatever community we're talking about, community of plants, can't cope. Next slide. What is a community? I've also used this word a lot in the last wee while. So when I say OVAG is a community of practice, it's basically, here's an example of a definition. It's a network of individuals who share vulnerabilities, risks, and adaptive capacities. A community is where you feel like you belong and where you feel like you have support. And by building communities, that's how we build up human resilience and provide a population that can cope. That's effective with that. When we talk about community engagement and conservation, we're usually talking about going out and talking to people in the local area who may not be as engaged in conservation as ourselves. But the actual term, in English at least, community, is much more wide-ranging. I understand from our Indonesian colleagues that the word catastrophe is quite difficult to translate into English. But it's very difficult from English, should I say. But to go through these different steps, because we are trying not to use emergency, disaster, catastrophe interchangeably. They mean different things. So you can be in an emergency, which is challenging to your resources and capabilities, but you have a population and a community that can cope with that. In an emergency of a fire, but it's not yet a disaster because we have prepared ourselves to make sure we can respond effectively. And that's very important, to make sure we've prepared before it becomes a disaster. And then it can lead into what we say is a catastrophe, where all the resources are completely overwhelmed. And that, of course, is leading into that which we do not want. Next slide, please. Kevin will be working through some very good ground level templates and processes and exercises that will hopefully make it real on what we're talking about disaster reduction to you. And that's one reason why after the break we're going to be concentrating on listening from you guys as to what you have been dealing with. I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up, but I'm just going to say here that what's on the screen there, why we're dealing with this now, is the UNDRR, which is the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, has a hashtag no natural disasters. So this is really reinforcing what I've just said, that a hazard can only become a disaster once it impacts on society or community, and a hazard is natural, or it can be human-induced, obviously, but disasters are not. Thank you. Next slide. So We've had some reflections here. One of the reasons that OVAG was set up in 2009 is trying to prevent the disaster of what happened here in Indonesia in the late 1990s with forest fire and what have you. Dean Chitra provided us with a talk on the cost of the forest fires versus the income from the oil palm from that year in Indonesia, and the cost of the forest fires was higher than the income from oil palm. So all of these different things are part of what we call an all-hazard situation that have unintended consequences. Next slide. And you know that why now is these natural hazards occur all the time, but they are also, we suspect, well, they're occurring with more frequency, and they are becoming more severe. So this is obviously some examples from Indonesia. Next slide as well. And I've heard different, and we've heard different ideas on what percentage of the Tapanuli orangutans have been lost. The reference I found on this was published in Current Biology, so it ranged from 7 to 14%. But again, this directly impacts the work that we do. Next slide, please. I recently visited Portugal, as in a couple of weeks ago, and although Portugal has quite a dry climate, the increasing frequency of these situations that have become uncontrollable is increasing, and this is all part of the climate crisis. And I know folks here in Southeast Asia will recognize this last bit, where it says Greek authorities warn of toxic smoke. It's because of forest fire smoke going across boundaries. So just like infectious diseases, natural hazards that form disasters do not know geopolitical boundaries, and that can start to cause political friction between countries. Next slide, please. Back in Australia, before I moved to Australia in 2022, and these were the signs that were presented to me on the outskirts of Sydney, where I was moving to. And it says here, catastrophic floods, are they really a 1 in 1,000 year event? And Kevin will delve into that in more detail. Next slide, please. The opposite, Australia, as you know, you think is an issue with drought, but this comes into the understanding that there are ways you can measure this to be able to predict what's going to be coming up into the future. And Kevin will be looking at situations in Indonesia where you are actually very good at being able to futurecast what's going to be coming up. Next. So these changes have, these global sorts of events have driven how we responding to these sorts of things, and hopefully make us better prepared. So after the last decade, our advice has moved, certainly in Australia, from leave early to a safe place away from the fire and impact zone, because we have gained more experience, because they're becoming more frequent. Next. Now, I'm going to spend the last few minutes just going through this, and it's going to be a rapid fire through, but this is why we need to understand the importance of what we can do with social behavior and disease control. So, next. So we have an event, a zoonotic disease outbreak in wildlife, and this is what we're going to be talking about tomorrow. Next. Now, how we can approach this disease outbreak is look at what the patterns of behavior of the authorities or the folk who are involved in that outbreak may be able to do. So what is impeding us to effectively manage that zoonotic disease? And that could be a lack of One Health behavior between government agencies and changing climate patterns combined to make the event worse. We can then delve deeper. Are the systems in place? So are there limits from trusting communications or effective infrastructure between those interest holders, in the West we'd call them stakeholders, due to scarce resource allocation? So we often hear people don't focus on wildlife, rightly so, in most circumstances, because there are other issues that are much more important or urgent in survival. But a way to think about this is understanding how these structures can be integrated to cover all these things. And obviously a zoonotic disease, that's something that can impact on human health as well. But the real way that you can increase your leverage to be able to change the event that you see on the surface in understanding the values and motivations of those who have impact and interest and influence over the event on how to manage that zoonotic disease. Next slide. And don't read this, but this is how you can, this is just 2 examples of bovine TB and high-path avian influenza of how we're starting to understand. Yes, I know I'm at time, but we're actually quite early, so I also know that as well. So, and that is something that when we're going through over the next couple of days, start to think of why do people behave the way they do in disasters? Why do people not understand the world that I understand? And this is why it's important to understand those other people's motivations so you can bring them along to be able to impact the events and situations. Next slide, please. So I'm finishing it up. It's a risk-based approach is the way forward. So we want to move from a community that can't cope to a community that can cope. And this is why there are many projects that are focused on that community improvement and development of capacity and capability, because then if you turn a community into a community that can, with an event or hazard, then you no longer have the disaster. And there are treatments for this. And the word here is being prepared. What often happens with us as humans is we don't do anything until we have to respond to something. And so that's what all this week is about, is making sure we are prepared. Last slide. Next. And the other one I've mentioned where it says language matters is risk. We talk about there are 2 components of this, the likelihood or probability of something happening, and what we often forget about is what the consequences of that are. And that's why we need to take a big picture view of this, is if we may be focused on protecting the orangutan from a forest fire or from a landslide, however we manage that, you need to take into account the consequences. And that's the last point I'll make, because not only for time, but Kevin's going to be going into this in a lot more detail, that I mentioned this all-hazard approach because we need to sort of look at all the potential hazards that could be a problem. But when it comes to risk management, your role, your organization's role can't do everything. You are part of the puzzle. And Joe is going to illustrate that now. Part of the solution, not the puzzle, part of the solution. Joe is going to introduce that now in a very real way with some pretty amazing slides and talk. So over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, team. How are we? Good, good.